This amendment strikes a section that allows the administration to consider expanding the CLEAN program. Now, as a reminder, the CLEAN program, the FAA provides awards to industry to develop and integrate technology that will reduce noise, emissions, and fuel burn. Now, looking over some of the projects, some of them aren't completely useless. Improvements to wing performance and thermal efficiency for turbines may well contribute to cost savings. But that actually begs the question, why can't these projects be funded by private industry alone? Surely if they improve fuel efficiency, that's a clear profit-driven motive to invest in new technologies. The program also funds the development of quote-unquote alternative jet fuels, which is just another facet of the left's crusade to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to meet completely arbitrary and unscientific targets. The administration aims to achieve quote-unquote net zero greenhouse emissions from the aviation sector by 2050. Now, I want you to think about that because you won't be flying when that happens. The so-called sustainable aviation fuel is critical to achieving this foolhardy goal. However, this fuel doesn't change the physics of an engine. The engine still emits carbon dioxide. Instead, emissions are actually produced out of waste products like cooking oil and agricultural waste instead of fossil fuels. And then the engine burns that. That's what you're paying for. The program makes taxpayers pay for that fuel. These fuels are extremely expensive and not widely adopted, as low as 0.1% at last counting. The CLEAN program acknowledges these shortcomings. CLEAN Phase 2 simply furthered the understanding of key biofuel properties and demonstrating viability of them. So it acknowledges it actually not really changing anything. We're just spending a lot of money burning cooking oil in an aviation engine. There's absolutely no reason we should actually be expanding this program that's pouring taxpayer dollars into technologies into which the public sector is unwilling to invest. They're unwilling to invest because there's no money in this. The only way it works is if the taxpayers pour all their money into it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I rise to claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. This amendment would strike the requirement that the FAA administrator consider expanding the CLEAN program, which stands for Continuous Lower Energy Emission and Noise Program, to new entrants. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't necessarily mean new technologies or different kinds of technologies, as much as it can also mean new companies that are looking to do the same thing but do it better. To ensure that the FAA administrator is not continually approving grants to existing companies that are already in the program who may not be succeeding, we want to be sure the FAA administrator is looking beyond the current slate of companies that are applying. In addition to that, of course, there are new entrants in the airspace. There's more use, there's more projected use of even electronic aircraft. In the future, hydrogen is being looked at as a fuel for aviation. Not tomorrow, and maybe not in 5 years, but certainly within the next 10 to 15 years. And doing some of the early work in this field is very important, so the FAA administrator needs the authority and the freedom to do just that. This amendment is pulling back on some of the innovation that we, frankly, can only look to the government to do so that it builds the foundation for the private sector to build upon, and sometimes in this industry to take off as well. So I would ask folks to oppose this amendment, let the administrator continue to administer the CLEAN program, but send a clear message that they need to be looking beyond the regular sort of entrance that they're getting into this program, and look to the future of aviation when they look at the CLEAN program. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I thank the chairman. My friend on the other side of the aisle is a good man. He's just, I think, misdirected on this occasion. Look, I'll be clear. I don't want the administrator to be spending time approving this contractor or that contractor. I don't want him doing any of it. And as far as hydrogen, I marvel at this premise that somehow the government is the only one that can figure this out. Somehow this country invented the internal combustion engine, the light bulb, the airplane. went to space. But heaven forbid we can figure this out without the government, without these taxpayers being forced to pay for it. The third phase of the CLEAN program is awarding more than $100 million for aircraft and engine companies to develop and demonstrate aircraft technologies that reduce fuel use, emissions, and noise. Relating to sustainable aviation gas, CLEAN funds are trying to research higher blends of biofuels to petroleum-based fuels, which can affect seal performance. On average, this fuel costs 3 to 5 times more than conventional jet fuel. We already have the jet fuel. It's already efficient. It's already clean. We've already reduced emissions more than all the other countries combined. We already met the Paris Climate Accord requirements without even being in the accord. Now, other barriers to the adoption include risks related to adoption, including safety. Ladies and gentlemen, as a person who has sat behind the stick, who's been up in the air, I can tell you the pucker factor is pretty high when the engine quits. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be experimenting with fuel while I'm up in the air. And I don't want the pilots up front to be forced to experiment with it because the government says so. We have something that works. The private sector can figure this out. They can invest in it. They can pay for it, and they can perfect it. With that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there is a race on. There is a race on in aviation, a race to implement and use new fuels that are more efficient, that are also cleaner. There's a race on, and other countries and regions of the world are investing in that race, putting their companies at a competitive advantage over the U.S.-based companies. The CLEAN program is one of our tools to participate in that race. The CLEAN program also helps us invest in fuel efficiency, in the fuel efficiency of aviation, which has helped reduce aviation fuel burn in this country. It's a direct relationship between the goodness of the taxpayer investment in the CLEAN program to the new fuel-efficient airplanes that we see being used today and the fuel-efficient engines that we see being used today. The next version of that, the next step of that race is in sustainable aviation fuel, it's in electric propulsion, and in the future, it's hydrogen propulsion. There is quite a bit of private sector investment going on in the use of hydrogen as a fuel to move things, including airplanes. Now, we're not quite there yet in this country in the private sector, but no one else is either. I want to win that race, and part of winning that race is ensuring that the federal government is a partner in winning that race. And winning that race in aviation is ensuring that FAA has tools like CLEAN to be sure that it is a partner with airlines, with entrepreneurs, with innovators who want us to participate in this race. So I'd ask folks to oppose this amendment, and with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Pennsylvania
Mr.
is
Chairman,
recognized.
can I inquire as to the time remaining?
Gentleman has 30 seconds remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We don't need to provide more subsidies to support this climate-smart agricultural practice and production of aviation biofuel feedstocks. Actually makes your food more expensive because we're burning your fuel in an aircraft instead of pumping it out of the ground where the fuel has come from and has worked very, very well. Up to $3 billion in DOE loan guarantees. I want to win the race too. But the federal government picking winners and losers ensures that we probably will lose the race because we're going to pick the wrong one as the federal government normally does. Once again, this is an absurd policy, and if it were viable at all, the private sector would invest in it. I urge adoption, and I yield the balance.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington, you are recognized, and you have 1.5 minutes remaining.
If going to the moon in 1969 was viable at all, the private sector would have done it. It didn't. We did it. America did it, and America did it with investment. I'm not making the wild claim exactly that going to the moon is exactly this kind of race that we're faced with. But there's a clear role for the federal government to play in a partnership with innovators and entrepreneurs to ensure that the next generation of innovation in aviation happens in the United States and not elsewhere. So I would ask folks to support the CLEAN program, to not limit its use, and to oppose this amendment. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment.